Hey, what's going on, everyone? It's Felix here with your Word on the Street, and today we're continuing our study into the book of the Revelation of Jesus Christ, specifically talking about the impact of Babylon's fall and how the world will mourn for its falling out of power. In chapter 17, we were able to see a couple of things, okay? First, we got to see the power that was behind the religious Babylon, known as the false religion. And we also got to see the power of the beast, known as the Antichrist. And in that chapter, we got to see how the Antichrist will destroy his false prophet and take everything that he had obtained since the rapture of the church and will destroy the false prophet at the end of chapter 17. So now let's open up our Bibles to Revelation chapter 18, verses 9 to 20, in a teaching entitled, The World Mourns Babylon's Fall. Beginning in verse 9, John writes that the kings of the earth who committed fornication and lived luxuriously with her will weep and lament for her when they see the smoke of her burning, standing at the distance for fear of her torment, saying, Alas, alas, that great city Babylon, that mighty city, for in 1 hour your judgment has come. So let's take a look at these first two verses here in this passage. And this specific section of chapter 18, we get to see how the great impact of the fall of Babylon is around the world, okay? And just by seeing the destruction of the city, we can see how big the influence was. I mean, there's going to be leaders and governments that remain within the world that will go into mourning because of its fall. And some of these leaders depend on the Antichrist for survival. Some rely on the goods and the services that come from Babylon, and some of these places will still be trying to recover even from the last disaster. And the point is that God will not rest or relent upon the evil of the world. He will ensure that all evil will be destroyed and reduced to nothing but ash. And one thing to remember is that the mourning that is occurring in Babylon, it's going to be symbolic of the mourning that's going to be going on all over the world. It shows the self-centeredness of governments and the leaders. And their basic meal ticket at the end of time will be destroyed. And now what are they going to do? What they fail to realize is that Jesus is coming, and this is part of the plan. And in the second part of the passage from verses 11 to 17, we specifically see how all of these businesses from the world are going to be devastated by the fall of Babylon. John mentions at least 25 different distinct types of products in Scripture just to show us how materialistic the world is. And he says, starting in verse 11, that the merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her, for no one buys their merchandise anymore. Merchandise of gold, silver, precious stones, pearls, fine linen and purple, silk and scarlet, every kind of citron wood, every kind of object of most precious wood, bronze, iron, and marble. And he says in verse 13 that cinnamon, incense, fragrant oils, frankincense, wine, oil, flour, and wheat, cattle, sheep, horses, chariots, bodies and souls of men, the fruit that your soul longed for has gone from you, and you shall find them no more at all. The merchants of these things who became rich by her will stand at a distance for fear of her torment, weeping and wailing. And then he says in verse 16, Alas, alas, the great city that was clothed in fine linen, purple, scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls. And it's interestingly is that the key to why the world is mourning is evidenced here in verse 17, where John says in part A, he says, For in 1 hour such great riches came to nothing. So the stuff is all they care about. They mourn the loss of so much wealth. And we have to remember that at this time, Babylon actually enslaved the world. It's considered a holocaust of attacks against those who follow Christ, as well as those against the Jews. And people will mean nothing more than a piece of property or an item, and how people can benefit the Antichrist is all that's going to matter. And then John continues in verse 17, in the second part of 17, he says, and he writes that even these who are in the commercial businesses of shipping, importing, and exporting the goods, they're going to be mourning. And if you remember, just during COVID even, how terrible things got, that we couldn't even get things like toilet paper or certain products, the world was actually falling apart. And this, however, is on a godly scale of having no products. And he writes, Every shipmaster All who travel by the ship, sailors, and as many others on trade on the sea, stood at a distance. And in verse 18, and they cried out when they saw the smoke of her burning, saying, what is like in this great city? They threw it literally on their heads and cried out, weeping and wailing, saying, alas, alas, the great city, in which all who had the ships on the sea became rich by her wealth, for in 1 hour she is much desolate. The destruction is catastrophic in nature, and the effects will be worldwide, or at least what's left of it. And those who actually survive through this event have little left to eat, drink, and to use. But not all places are mourning. Check out what John says, and he writes about in heaven. When he writes up in verse 20, he says, rejoice over her, O heaven, and you, holy apostles and prophets, for God has avenged you on her. There will be heavenly rejoicing in this. The fall of Babylon means that the ungodliness and the evil of the world are being conquered. It means that the righteousness of Jesus will soon return and be established on earth as he sets up his kingdom. And there will be no more rejection of God by those who do not believe, and he will be worshipped and served by all of the followers of Christ. It's also going to be a time of vindication for those who suffered abuse and persecution. The author of Hebrews actually said that the vengeance belongs to God and that he will recompense. He will judge his people. Revelation chapter 18, verses 9 to 20, the world mourns Babylon's fall, and that's your word on the street.